There's a fault running directly beneath one of the most famous skylines in America, and for most of the 20th century, nobody knew it was there, not because it was hidden. In some remote, unstudied wilderness, it sits beneath downtown Los Angeles itself, underneath skyscrapers, underneath freeways, underneath millions of people going about their daily lives, with no visible sign on the surface that anything dangerous lies beneath them at all. It took a catastrophic earthquake and years of careful scientific investigation afterward before geologists finally understood what had actually been sitting there the whole time. And now, in late 2025, an entirely different set of California faults just got a formal update to their own official maps. A quiet, technical, easy-to-miss piece of news that actually tells a much bigger story about how much of California's earthquake danger still hides in plain sight, waiting to be found. Today, we're going to dig into exactly what changed, what it reveals about how these hidden hazards actually get discovered, and why the scariest faults in California aren't always the ones you can see. Subscribe to the channel before we get into this, because I dig into exactly this kind of story, the ones where careful, patient science slowly uncovers something that was sitting right beneath everyone's feet the entire time. Let's start with what actually happened, the concrete factual event at the center of this story. In late November 2025, the California Geological Survey formally released new and revised earthquake fault zone maps for a specific set of communities, the city of Half Moon Bay, San Mateo County, and Santa Cruz County along the coast, and separately, the cities of Arcadia, Glendale, La Cañada Flint Ridge, Monrovia, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre, along with the broader county of Los Angeles. These aren't casual, informal maps. They're official regulatory documents created under a specific state law, and their release came paired with two detailed technical investigations, one covering the Sierra Madre fault zone, the other covering the San Gregorio fault zone, each one representing years of careful geologic fieldwork condensed into a formal, legally binding update. To understand why a map update like this genuinely matters, you have to go back more than half a century, to February 9th, 1971, the day the ground beneath the northern San Fernando Valley tore open along a fault line that, at the time, most residents living directly above it had no idea existed. The magnitude, 6.6 San Fernando earthquake, killed dozens of people and caused enormous damage. And in its aftermath, investigators uncovered something specifically troubling. Some of that damage hadn't come from shaking alone. It had come from the ground itself, physically rupturing directly beneath structures that had been built without anyone realizing they were sitting on an active fault trace. That realization led directly to the passage of the Alquist-Priolo Earthquake Fault Zoning Act. The following year, a law built on a genuinely simple, sobering premise that California didn't yet have a complete picture of exactly where its faults actually were, and that incomplete picture had cost lives. That's the deeper story behind every single Alquist-Priolo map update that's happened in the more than 5 decades since, including this one. Each release represents another piece of California's hidden fault network finally being pinned down with enough scientific confidence to become official, binding regulation. The Sierra Madre Fault, at the center of this most recent update, traces along the base of the San Gabriel Mountains, threading beneath Pasadena, Glendale, Arcadia, Monrovia, La Cañada Flint Ridge, and Sierra Madre, exactly the communities named in this release. It's part of a broader family of faults, responsible for slowly, relentlessly pushing the San Gabriel Mountains skyward over hundreds of thousands of years, one earthquake at a time, and it's already demonstrated its capability directly. In 1991, it produced a magnitude 5.8 earthquake that shook the northern San Gabriel Valley, causing genuine damage and injuries despite being, by the standards of what this fault system is understood to be capable of, a comparatively modest event. The San Gregorio Fault tells an entirely different geographic story, running largely along the coastline north of Monterey Bay, through Half Moon Bay, San Mateo County, and Santa Cruz County, connected mechanically to the broader San Andreas fault system through the same right lateral side-slipping motion that makes the San Andreas itself so famous. Geologists consider this fault capable of producing earthquakes in the magnitude 7 range, a genuinely serious hazard sitting directly beneath coastal communities that, for decades, had only a partial, evolving picture of exactly where the fault's true boundaries lay. Now here's the question that I think deserves the most careful, honest answer in this entire story, because it's exactly the question the title of this video is asking. When a map like this changes, does it mean the underlying danger has grown? Does it mean the big one is somehow closer than it was the week before? I want to walk you through the actual mechanics of what a map update represents. Because the answer is genuinely more interesting and more revealing about how science actually works than a simple yes or no. A fault doesn't become more dangerous because a map gets redrawn. The Sierra Madre Fault and the San Gregorio Fault were exactly as capable of producing a damaging earthquake the day before this release as they were the day after. What changed is something considerably more human and in its own way more fascinating: our collective ability to actually see where these faults truly sit. Geologists conducting the fieldwork behind this update spent years in these specific areas, digging exploratory trenches across suspected fault traces, examining the layered soil and rock exposed within those trenches for the telltale signs of past ground rupture, sediment layers displaced or offset in ways that only an earthquake could produce, and cross-referencing that physical evidence against decades of accumulated seismic and geodetic data. That's genuinely painstaking, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely makes headlines on its own, spending months in a narrow trench cut into a hillside, carefully documenting soil layers millimeter by millimeter, looking for the specific signature that separates an ordinary geologic layer from one that's been torn and offset by an ancient earthquake. And this is exactly the same fundamental process that eventually revealed the fault beneath downtown Los Angeles that I mentioned at the start, the Puente Hills. Thrust wasn't discovered through a dramatic single event. It emerged slowly through years of subsurface seismic imaging and careful analysis following the 1987 Whittier Narrows earthquake, and later, the devastating 1994 Northridge earthquake, both of which were eventually traced to blind thrust faults, meaning faults that never break the surface at all, hidden entirely beneath the ground, detectable only through indirect evidence rather than any visible trace a geologist could simply walk up to and examine directly. USGS researchers eventually identified the Puente Hills thrust, running directly beneath a significant stretch of downtown Los Angeles, and they've specifically described it as one of the greatest urban seismic hazards anywhere in the country, precisely because of what sits directly above it, one of the densest, most economically vital urban cores in the United States, and because its buried nature makes it inherently more difficult to study, map, and fully understand compared to a fault with a clear, walkable surface trace like the Sierra Madre. That distinction between faults you can see and faults you can't is genuinely the deepest thread running through this entire story. California's Alquist Priolo program and map updates like the one that just happened are fundamentally built around faults with identifiable surface traces, the kind geologists can dig a trench across and directly examine. But some of the state's most consequential earthquakes in modern history, Whittier Narrows in 1987, Northridge in 1994, both catastrophic, both deadly, both economically devastating, originated on blind faults that never showed themselves on the surface at all. That means there's an entire category of California's earthquake hazard that this specific regulatory framework, however important and however continuously refined, structurally cannot fully capture, hazards hiding directly beneath major population centers, waiting to be found the same slow, patient way that Puente Hills thrust eventually was, through the aftermath of an earthquake, or through targeted subsurface investigation long before one ever occurs. So, when you ask whether the big one is getting closer because a map just changed, I think the more honest and genuinely more unsettling question is this: how much of California's true earthquake hazard still remains entirely unmapped, sitting quietly beneath cities and neighborhoods that have no idea what's underneath them, waiting for exactly the kind of careful, patient geologic detective work that eventually revealed the Sierra Madre Fault's true extent, or the Puente Hills thrust's hidden presence beneath downtown Los Angeles? The broader statistical picture, at least, offers a genuinely useful frame for understanding where the known risk currently stands. California's Uniform California earthquake. Rupture forecast estimates meaningful 30-year probabilities for major earthquakes. Across the state's mapped fault network, and two faults in particular carry a specific kind of statistical weight worth understanding. The southern San Andreas fault hasn't ruptured in a major event since 1857, meaning that section has now gone considerably longer without releasing its accumulated stress than its historical average recurrence pattern would suggest, and USGS scenario modeling for a magnitude 7.8 or larger rupture along that stretch projects roughly 1/800 deaths, 50,000 injuries, and $200 billion in direct damage. The Hayward Fault, threading directly beneath Oakland, Berkeley, and Fremont in the East Bay, carries a similarly elevated statistical urgency, sitting at, or beyond its own average recurrence interval, running directly under sections of the BART transit system, relied upon by hundreds of thousands of daily commuters. I want to be genuinely careful with how I frame this, because overdue in seismology is a statistical description, not a prediction. It means the accumulated stress on these specific fault segments has had an unusually long time to build relative to historical patterns, feeding directly into those 30-year probability calculations. But it says nothing about the actual timing of the next rupture, which remains entirely beyond the reach of current earthquake science to forecast with any precision. What I find genuinely compelling about this entire story, when you step back and look at the whole picture together, is how much of California's earthquake future depends not on some singular, dramatic discovery, but in exactly this kind of slow, careful, almost invisible scientific labor, geologists spending years in trenches, cross-referencing decades of data, updating official regulatory maps parcel by parcel, community by community, patiently expanding humanity's understanding of a hazard that's been sitting beneath this landscape for millions of years, long before any city was ever built on top of it. The map that just changed for Half Moon Bay, San Mateo County, Santa Cruz County, and the communities ringing the San Gabriel Mountains represents exactly one small, careful piece of that much larger, ongoing effort. An effort that will likely never be fully finished, because California's fault network is simply too vast, too complex, and in places too deeply buried for any single generation of scientists to map completely. If you live anywhere in California, this story is worth more than just its narrative intrigue. The California Geological Survey maintains a public tool called EQ-ZAP, allowing anyone to enter their specific address and see exactly what officially mapped seismic hazards, including Alquist-Priolo fault zones, sit near their own home, an easy way to become part of the story rather than simply hearing about it from a distance. And if you're anywhere near the communities named in this recent update specifically, Half Moon Bay, San Mateo, or Santa Cruz County, or Arcadia, Glendale, La Cañada Flintridge, Monrovia, Pasadena, and Sierra Madre, it's genuinely worth checking whether your own property now falls within a newly updated zone. I'll be watching for whatever the California Geological Survey releases next, because a story like this one is never really finished. It's simply the latest chapter in an investigation that's been quietly unfolding since 1971 and shows no signs of concluding anytime soon. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and drop a comment below if you live in any of the communities covered by this release, or if you've ever discovered that your own home sits closer to a mapped fault than you realized. Stay curious about what's hidden directly beneath the ground you walk on every day, because as this entire story proves, some of the most consequential discoveries in earthquake science aren't found through a single dramatic event. They're found one careful trench, one patient investigation, one quietly updated map at a time. I will see you in the next one.